So from one day to the next, you go from the Spanish colonizer to U.S. colonizer. Now we know the Spanish, we don't know these other motherfuckers.
Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Ramiro from ANTICONQUISTA. ANTICONQUISTA is an anti-imperialist media collective. Our content is produced by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. And today we're talking about the history of Puerto Rican resistance with Comrade Libre. Comrade Libre is an Afro-Boricua poet and communist based out of Miami, Florida, whose organizing involves theory and action. Their work primarily involves working with youth to foster radical imagination, helping build alternatives outside of capitalism, like community gardens, and organizing community towards international proletarian struggle. How's it going, comrade?
All is well over here in Miami. A little breezy, but it's all good.
By the way, before we get into talking about Puerto Rico, I just got to give you props for being in Miami as a Latino communist, as a revolutionary. That must be no joke. How is that out there?
It's always interesting. In my mind, I'm always like, thank goodness I didn't grow up here as a Caribbean. I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and you know, that gave me a very different perspective being like Afro-Boricua, because again, Milwaukee is the most segregated city in the US. So you come somewhere like Miami, get older, and you hear Cubans, you know, the ones that we don't like, we call them gusanos, you know, they'll be like, oh, I'm white. I'll be like, you white? Bro, where are you from?
Right.
Like, where I grew up is like anything that ain't white, like, you Mexican. Right, so it's a very different context, and it really helped inform how I move. But yeah, growing up here or being in Miami now is like you're at the center of international fascism, right, and capitalism, and you get to see, you know, the people that probably helped mess up their own country during the Cold War time period that come here on vacation and go shopping, and the Trump 2020. You know, Trump 2020, it's like, bro, if you go anywhere north, they ain't gonna have it, you know?
Right.
It's really weird, and it definitely creates some barriers, but thankfully the younger generation, you know, is moving away, and some places talk about it, but you know, the younger generation is more accustomed to and really taking heat to socialism and communism. And it's not like if you say it, they're like scared and they're gonna, you know, talk all types of craziness. So
yeah, that's what's up. No, I mean, shout out to you for doing that, because that's organizing in Miami, like you said. That's where all the gusanos, the contras from Nicaragua, the Venezuelan escualidos, that's where they all kind of meet up and organize. And so it's so important for our people, for Latinos, to be there organizing, creating an anti-imperialist opposition to that. And so going into a little bit about the history of Puerto Rican resistance, first of all, why we're discussing it. A lot of people in the U.S., especially out here, I'm out here in Los Angeles on the West Coast, unfortunately are not really familiar with the history of Puerto Rican resistance. And it's so important because not only is Puerto Rico one of the oldest U.S. colonies, it's still one of the last formal U.S. colonies. Of course, now it has the title of Commonwealth, but we all know that's bullshit. It's basically under U.S. colonial domination, along with Hawaii and Guam. And more importantly, the case of Puerto Rico really exemplifies the brutality and nature of U.S. colonialism and imperialism. You know, the U.S. likes to go around the world and accuse countries, for example, like China, of being like, oh, you're, you know, spreading your influence. There's no democracy and this and that. And Puerto Rico is just a classic example right in front of us of how undemocratic, how brutal the U.S. is. And so I think it's important that we discuss the history of Puerto Rican resistance because of that, because not only does it inspire us to keep fighting against these systems that oppress our people, but it also shows that the U.S. is not in favor of democracy as it claims to be. And so before we get into some of the specifics of the history of Puerto Rican resistance, what I wanted to ask you is to tell us a little bit more about yourself, how you got involved in revolutionary politics and communist politics, and why you think studying Puerto Rico's revolutionary history is important.
Definitely. And before I get into that, and I forgot to open up with it, I want to pay my respects to the indigenous folks here on Turtle Island. Where I come from here in Miami, it's the Miccosukee and Tequesta people. And we just want to acknowledge that we're on stolen land. So I'll start by saying that. And in terms of what brought me towards socialism and to consider myself communist, it was like a mix of things, right? Again, I grew up in the most segregated city in the U.S. And the first time ever leaving the state, I went to Kampala, Uganda in Africa. And I grew up in the hood, right? So I'm growing up in the hood. My first time ever leaving the place I grew up was going to the motherland, right? So I get there, and guess what I see? I see these, where the common folk live, and you see these tin roofs that are reflective of Borinquen, before industrialization. And I see myself in the youth that are there. And I was like, wait, I know I grew up poor, but kind of this realization that it's not just in the hood, it's in everywhere across the world, that there are working class people, that there are people that are experiencing the effects of capitalism. And I didn't really have the words for it then, but I reflect on it now and I was like, yo, this makes perfect sense. To understand that, in the world that we live, they try to make it seem like we're all so different. And there are differences, right? But there's a common thread. Capitalism oppresses everybody unless you're a capitalist, and most people are not capitalists. They just think they are. That's how the system works. And so as I began to travel and see a reflection of where I grew up in other places, I started to want to get a sense of identity, because I didn't grow up in Borinquen. I grew up in Milwaukee. So as I began to learn about the history of the place that I come from, where my family comes from, I started to learn some like really messed up things. And then I went to university and I had very racist experiences because of the institutional racism that's inherently in private institutions. And eventually I make my way to Miami, and I have a homie, Comrade Khalil, from Nicaragua. And he's like, hey, like, you should look into, Marxism, Leninism. And I was like, bruh, that's some white people. Like, my liberation is not going to come through these white people. Yeah. And he's like, well, what would you want to read then? And I was like, yo, I need to read people that look like me. The brown people, the black people, anybody that's not white. Yeah. And so we started reading Walter Rodney. He was very patient with me, right? We started reading Walter Rodney, and we started getting into Thomas Sankara and other individuals. And I started reading them, and I was like, oh, bet. Okay, so they're all talking about Marxist-Leninism. And then I realized it's never been about Marx. It's never been about Lenin, right? I think that there is an inherent way in which we are naturally born communists. Like, and I'm gonna, put that out there. It can, in scientific socialism, it can be debated, but I think we're naturally born social beings. And so the practice of socialism is one that is natural to humans. We have to learn to live in capitalism, right? We have to learn that based on somebody's skin color, like that they are better or worse, apparently. But it's not true, right? What is true is that we need to be in community. And so as I began to get more principled in my understandings, I was like, yo, I can, yeah, definitely. This Marxist-Leninism, this makes sense. This is how people in Burkina Faso free themselves. This is how the Cubans like move towards independence, and North Korea and China, right? All on the understanding that they are oppressed, and that if they want to get away from that, they have to use scientific socialism to move towards a society that meets the needs of people and like actually wants your input, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I was definitely one of those. Nah, they white, but then it's like it's about the ideology,
Exactly.
and it's just a term, right? Like the things that we do and the things that we develop out of that continue to grow. It's just a name for it. It's a label. It has nothing to do with who brought it in. They just kind of helped us put that thing together, and we make it our own thing, right?
Right.
Based
Yeah,
on
that's
the
exactly right.
conditions.
That's exactly right. And you hit the key word, which is scientific socialism. It's like it's like a science that's objective, regardless of whether it was Marx or Lenin. And if it weren't Marx or Lenin, someone else would have put forward it. Just like you said, and others, Walter Rodney, Thomas Sankara, Fidel Castro. And it's like getting mad at Newton and being like, I don't believe in gravity. That's a white man's theory. Well, it's like, no, it's an objective law that was discovered, that was analyzed by Marx and Lenin, that they're just explaining. And so I'm so glad you mentioned that, because nowadays with postmodern leftism, there's so much they attempt to divide the history of indigenous and black resistance with Marxism and Leninism when they're so interconnected. And that's what I hope we'll get into a little bit right now with Puerto Rico, because there's so many clear examples of that. And Puerto Rico is a classic example of a place that has resisted capitalism, has resisted imperialism, led by indigenous and black folks who are revolutionaries, a lot of times also communists. So going into some of the history, I mean, I find it incredibly interesting that Puerto Rico was, I think, like the first, if not the second place that Columbus, quote unquote, discovered and landed in, naming it San Juan Bautista. In 1508, Juan Ponce de Leon established the first colony, Caparra. And in 1511, just a few years later, you have Agüevana II leading the Taino revolt against the Spanish. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what that time period was like, what that era of conquest, right? After all, we're called Anticonquista, and that was the beginning of that conquest, right? What was life like in Borinquen at that time?
So Borinquen, it's important to understand when Haiti gained its independence, it renamed the island IET, right? So it's going back to pay respects. The African people were paying respect to the indigenous people. In the same way, like when I refer to the series of islands, because Borinquen's a series of islands. It's not just one. There's a large piece, but then there's adjoining islands. It's an archipelago. It's called Borinquen, which means land of the valiant lords in
cool.
Taino. And that's why we call ourselves Boricuas, right? And we gotta rep where we come from. But in that time, the colonizers weren't paying much attention to Borinquen when they initially found it, right? There was a lot more interest in Hispaniola, which would now be Quisqueya and Haiti, which Dominican Republic and Haiti. And so the indigenous people, they weren't really sure. There's a lot of myths going around at the time about these foreign individuals, right? And in around 1511, you have some really interesting events happening. And what we have to be rooted and grounded in when we're talking about indigenous folks, wherever they are, is that they will always be in a position where they are fighting for their independence despite what the books say, right? The history books. And so from the very inception, from the time that colonizers landed on the islands, we were fighting for independence, right? And we have to be rooted in that, and that kind of lays the groundwork for our history as a whole. But there are two major events, right? There's Cacique Urayoan, who I would argue was very principled, and I might even call him a scientific socialist of his time, right? An alchemist, right? So there was this theory that the Spaniards were immortal. So he's like, let's test this idea. So there's this Spanish individual, his last name is Salcedo, and he has to go across a river. And at this time, they had the indigenous folks carry their things across the river, including them. So he's like, yo, I got you. He got his homies from the tribe. He's like, all right, here's the plan. When we get to the deepest part of the river, we're going to hold him down underwater. If they're immortal, they will live. If they are mortal, they will die. And so they get to the deepest part of the river. They hold him down until he drowns. So what does Cacique Urayoan say? He lets all the caciques around Borinquen know and spreads the word that these are people. They can be killed. So you have a series of indigenous revolts happening throughout the island against the Spanish. And at the time, the Spanish had mixed feelings, right? Like I said, they're not really paying attention to it. They're like, well, is this worth it? There was a few people trying to like cultivate land. And you have Cacique Aguaybana II, who is really the leader of the caciques, and up until his death was against the Spanish being there in the first place. He's like, yo, we have to get these people out of here. The things that they're doing to our people, the torture, right? It's always interesting to study colonization, especially the Spanish, where they came with their Bibles, right? They took the people's land. They called us savage, but they're the ones killing children, women, right? Torturing people, right? I'm going to baptize you and then I'm going to kill you so that you can go to heaven, right? Yo, that's messed up. And so, again, for the indigenous people, this is one of their leaders, and there's a battle. The battle, one of the last battles, well, not the last, but he goes into battle against the Spanish. They had killed a lot of the Spanish already. The Spanish called reinforcements, and they brought out all these weapons, what eventually will be the enslavement of indigenous people. And then as the population begins to diminish because they're being overworked, right? They're seen as capital, right? They're not seen as human in the context of capitalism, as it always has been, right? This is something that you can use and use it until it's dead, and then you can replace it. Eventually, Bartolomé de las Casas writes a book, right? A brief summary in the case for indigenous people, or something along those lines. And he says the indigenous people are being treated horribly. Let's import Africans. So you have the importing of enslaved Africans to the Caribbean, a decent amount. I'd say maybe the estimates are about like 70 to 75% of enslaved Africans went to the Caribbean. They would die at quicker rates because it's a more extreme environment than somewhere like continental U.S. And so you have the Africans coming, and you have indigenous folks, right? There's this myth that the Tainos no longer exist. That's bullshit, right? And that's some colonial eugenics bullshit. Like, we were never entirely killed off, like, and extinct. We're still alive.
Yeah.
And so when the indigenous folks and the Africans begin to mix, what you have is a history of maroon colonies. In Spanish, we would call them cimarrones, right? So you have anti-capitalists, right? Because these individuals functioned outside of the context of capitalism and colonization that they were trying to impose on the people, and they created their own societies and like moved and funded these by raiding the villages of the colonizers. At the time, they had an understanding of medicine, they had an understanding of land, and they could always retreat to their places, which were usually up in the mountains, and colonizers couldn't get up there. So you have anti-capitalist colonies or anti-capitalist settlements happening all throughout the Caribbean. This is not something that's unique to Borinquen. It's happening in Cuba. It's happening in Jamaica, right, on the Dominican Republic, where people that they attempt to suppress and force into slavery, that they do not accept it, and the moment that they can, they escape and they create their own societies that function on a humane level, where they use the knowledge of land that was naturally born, that they were born into, instead of accepting the conditions of being treated like property, and having to live with this colonial reality. So Maroons and Maroon societies in general have very interesting history, and if we have more time, we could like really dive into it. But
that's beautiful. I mean, it's kind of like representative of like a commune, like you said. It's like they were building socialism and beginning toward communism on a local level in a way that's grounded in Black and Indigenous traditions and is based on the local conditions. And I think it's just beautiful to see also the culmination of Black and Indigenous folks coming together, two of the oppressed peoples by European conquest, resisting against their colonizers. I think it's just something beautiful. And going into the 1800s, I know the 1800s was a really important century in Puerto Rican history because of the fact that you have in the early 1800s, the Spanish crown begins losing a lot of its colonies. You have the quote unquote independence movements across the Americas, Simon Bolivar, Jose San Martin, Bernardo Higgins, you know, these movements that create national republics in Latin America, you know, some good stuff, some bad stuff, but still unfortunately led by criollos, still led by people who are descended by Europeans. And what's interesting about this time period is that Puerto Rico, it's like the grip on Puerto Rico was tightened because you had, you know, La Gran Colombia became independent, La Federación Centroamericana, Mexico, Peru, Argentina, like all these places that were gaining quote unquote independence, and Puerto Rico was still under the grip of the Spanish crown. And so it seems like the Spanish even tightened their grip on Puerto Rico. At that time period, they started growing some of the most valuable crops like sugar, tobacco, and coffee. In that time period, I mean, you talk about sugar, like that was one of the most valuable commodities, I think more valuable than like oil would be today. And so you had millions and millions of dollars worth of commodities that were extracted from Puerto Rico, taken to Europe and all over. And so tell us a little bit about like going into 1868, right? You have the huge event of anti-colonial resistance, the Grito de Lares uprising, against Spanish colonialism. Tell us a little bit about that. Who were some of the key figures, and what were they up against?
I always like to start the 1800s with paying respect to my ICNs, right? 1804, the Haitian Revolution, which really set, and I always mention it specifically because it's important to understand the context in which the abolition of slavery and militant resistance against colonizers, like when that thing started. And of course, like we were doing it all throughout the Caribbean, but 1804 proves, right, that enslaved people can free themselves, right? And the enslaved Africans really set, at least set for me, the groundwork for Latin America and the Caribbean in general to really make moves towards not only abolition of slavery, but this idea of self-determination, and unapologetically so, right? During the Haitian Revolution, they say, under Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who I got up here, right? Coupe la tête, boule la caille, right? Cut off the heads, burn the house, right? You want to come colonize us? We're not people that can be colonized, right? You're gonna pay the price for the things that you believe in, because we don't believe in it. We cannot live in a society where your reality is our existence. And so later in the 1800s, you have moves in Borinquen to abolish slavery. Um, and in some more context, right? 1868, Cuba's fighting for their freedom from Spain. And so there's a lot of talks between people about Borinquen. And so you have people like Ramon Emeterio de Betances, Ramon Emeterio Betances, right? Who, you know, he's well learned. He's very familiar with Spain. He studied there. He's also, you know, one of the individuals that believed Puerto Rico should have its own independence, right? That Puerto Rico did not need to rely on Spain to exist, and so he begins to work with a few individuals. You also have Eugenio Maria de Hostos, one of the greatest educators of his time. He helped Lima formalize their education system. Um, he went to Chile, La República Dominicana, and he really went throughout Latin America and the Caribbean and became very well known. In fact, when he was in Chile, he wrote a lecture scientifically arguing why universities should allow women to go to university. And to that effect, the following year, women were allowed to go to university in Chile, right? Um, and so you have this philosopher, educator that is fervently for the independence of Puerto Rico because he's traveling. He's seeing the countries that are liberating themselves. He's in talks with presidents from these countries that have gained their self-determination, but there's this longing for it where one comes from. And that's really important, right? This necessity, this need that is shared between him, Ramon Emeterio Betances, right? And Betances is particularly important because he used to write for a newspaper, and he used the pseudonym El Antillano, which means the Antillian. He's referring to the Antilles, which is another name for this series of islands located in the Caribbean. And he argued for an Antillean confederation, a unified Antillean front that would be able to not only like have self-determination, but to move towards the interests of those in the Antilles, right? At this point, a lot of these places were that were colonized were working towards the benefit of the Europeans at the time. And so these individuals, Segundo Belvis, worked with Ramon Emeterio Betances to plan the Grito de Lares, which they did with Lola Rodriguez de Tio, right? Who was an educated woman and is particularly important because before the Grito de Lares, you have she was a poet. She wrote La Borinqueña, which is the national anthem of Boricua people. And she's particularly interesting. Well, they're all really interesting because Maria de Hostos, Rodriguez de Tio, and Betances are working with the Cuban Revolutionary Party at the time. So they're helping like theorize and helping Cubans fight for their independence just across, you know, a few islands over. And they're making a case for the independence of their own country. And so this is particularly important because in the original version of La Borinqueña, she talks about and even romanticizes Cuba for their willingness to fight and says, Boricuas, we must be like the Cubans and fight for our independence. She's the one that is coined with the phrase Cuba and Puerto Rico, like they're dos alas del mismo pájaro, right? That they're in the same struggle for independence. They are two wings of the same bird, right? That's how close they are in their struggles for independence. And then so you have El Grito de Lares. Lares is a mountainous region, eastern part of the island, right? And so you have women and men working towards um, towards independence from Spain, and September 23rd, they light the signal to start the revolution, right, was to light a lamp on a porch, which they ended up doing. After which they go to the church, right, and I forget her name. She created the flag.
The flag.
This flag, right? This is the flag of Lares, which is the flag that was raised. They tore down the Spanish flag that was in the center of the city, and they put this flag up. They went to the church and told the priest to like, you know, make it official, right? Like the church must recognize that we have our independence. And so it was short-lived, but this is the first well-documented attempt of Boricuas to fight for independence against Spain.
It's beautiful. And the Grito de Lares uprising is one of my favorite uprisings in Latin American and Caribbean history because it's so early on and the political messaging was on point. It was about independence. It was about building up your people, supporting your people. And it's interesting because around that same time period, you had the rise of indigenous movements across Latin America that were fighting against colonizers. Like in the 1860s as well, in the 1850s, you had indigenous resistance to people like William Walker, who was a Confederate soldier who went to Nicaragua and tried to establish himself as president. And you had all these indigenous uprisings against the European settlers. Going into the 1890s, there's also an interesting time period because this is kind of like where the diaspora, especially the United States, plays a role because you have in 1895 leaders of the Grito de Lares who were in exile in New York City, joining the Puerto Rican Revolutionary Committee, which was founded on December 8th. And what's really interesting to me is that Jose Marti, who was the Cuban independence hero, freedom fighter, he was actually in New York around the same time period. He was traveling through all these different colleges in upstate New York, Union College, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and there was all of these societies of Latin American students, and a lot of them were Boricuas who were organizing for independence, and so that solidarity continues. And in 1897, tell us a little bit about, there's this uprising which became known as the Yauco uprising, led by Antonio Matei Lluveras. And basically, it was an uprising that was organized in the diaspora. So this is like one of the first times you see the diaspora in play in New York, where he was kind of like this richer, wealthier guy who was fundraising for Puerto Rican independence. And from what I read online, it said that he actually purchased thousands of machetes and distributed them among rebels in Puerto Rico, and the machete became one of the symbols of revolutionary activity in Puerto Rico. So why don't you tell us a little bit about 1897, that uprising, and walk us through as well into the Spanish-American War in 1898.
So it's important to understand that even in this time, right, there was a grito a lares. People are still, right, wanting to be the determiners of their own fate, to have independence in Borinquen. And so some of these people like had to leave for obvious reasons, right? If you are fighting against a government and are not successful, chances are you're either gonna take yourself and leave, or you're gonna be forced to leave. And so that's kind of it is interesting, and Boricuas do this throughout the history of Borinquen in general, where you do have a strong number of Boricuas that are outside of the islands, really championing, right, a move for independence and self-determination. And so, yeah, March of 1897, you have a second attempt to gain independence again from Spain, and you have this backing. Latin America is having conversations, right? They're in conversation. They're talking about Cuba, right? They're talking about Borinquen, and so there is support from in the Caribbean in general that is happening in favor of. And New York always, for some reason, happens to be the place where people unite. And so yes, you get these individuals that are diehard, like we need our independence, and it's again a pro-independence movement. There's still, it's kind of hard to determine like what ideology they were using at the time, but there is this necessity and this move towards independence. And November 25th, like Spain makes a move to grant Puerto Rico its autonomy, right? Which means like you're not free, but like you can associate with us. Like we'll give you seats in the court, but that's still, again, that's not what these folks wanted, which is why you have armed struggle and an attempt again. And this one's interesting because there was more involvement from the criollos too, right? To move away because they kind of felt a type of way about Spanish, and again, an attempt to gain liberation, and then this leads into the Spanish-American War, right? So you have some very disgruntled Boricuas, right? They're like, yo, we need our freedom, we need it right now. You have the U.S., right, and the Monroe Doctrine and Manifest Destiny, right? All these bullshit that's happening all simultaneously, right? There's all these things happening at one time, and the U.S. Under the Monroe Doctrine wanted to kick Europe out of the Americas so that they could help countries move towards a more democratic whatever, right? And so the Spanish-American War starts in Cuba when an American ship is bomb goes off. The U.S. blames it on the Spanish. Coincidentally,
right.
There's a ship that explodes, and so you have the Spanish-American War, and Spain is already weak at this time, right? And so President McKinley he's like, yo, we need Cuba, we need Puerto Rico, we need the Philippines. These, like, at that time, the thinking of capitalism and of global conquest was through the sea. So the Caribbean is really important, and the Philippines is important because it connects to Asia and plays a role over there. So these are strategic wins. Spain is already weak. They can't fully support fighting a full-out war against the U.S. They're weak. So what happens, we go into the Treaty of Paris. July 20, I'm getting ahead of myself. You have the Treaty of Paris that happens December 10th, in which the U.S. Spain gives the U.S. Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, U.S., Puerto Rico, Guam, Hawaii, and there's more islands. I believe there's 5 in total, possibly more. Right? They're given as collateral damage, right? And it's important to understand that, right? The Boricuas had no say. They weren't even in the room, right? So from one day to the next, you go from Spanish colonizer to U.S. colonizer. Now we know the Spanish, we don't know these other motherfuckers, right? And so like you have this very weird time where people that like wanted some form of autonomy from Spain are now fighting for independence. So the Spanish-American War really creates some interesting dialogue amongst individuals back in the islands. But July 25th, 1898, the U.S. invades through Guanica under General Miles is the one who formally says, right, that this land now belongs to the U.S. And they move from Guanica up to Ponce, then they go to San Juan. They have an encounter with the Spanish military there. Eventually, they win and they raise the U.S. flag, right? Similar to the way that Spain would colonize by putting their flag there. And like Boricuas didn't know what to do because during the Spanish-American War, Puerto Rico was granted autonomy through Spain. So they already have their own form of currency, and they're working on forming their own senate, so that they can go to the courts and are like ask for things on behalf of the Boricua people. So again, throughout the Spanish-American War, the span of 2 years, Puerto Rico has a move towards some form of autonomy. Then the U.S. invades, so there's no more. Like it's like, nope. The U.S. is like, we're gonna save you from Spain, right?
Yeah.
The horrible Spanish, right? They are horrible, right?
Yeah.
But for the sake of this, it's like we're gonna save you from Spain. We're gonna control everything, and Puerto Rico's particularly weak because shortly after the Spanish-American War, you have a hurricane hit. It's called Hurricane Siraco, and it ran through the island. The U.S. offered no aid. Hint, hint.
Of course.
Like Hurricane Maria, you can create an analogy. They offered no aid, and not only did they not offer any aid, in 1901 they passed the Hollander Bill, which was a land tax, and farmers had to take that loan from a U.S. owned bank, and eventually so high that they couldn't afford. So the banks get the land, and who buys that land, right? It's the American businessmen. Then you have Charles Allen, governor, the U.S. appointed governor of Puerto Rico, because we can't elect anybody into office, right? We're a territory of the U.S., right? So Charles Allen, oddly enough, is also the president of Domino Sugar.
Wow.
So in his short time being governor of Puerto Rico, 45% of all arable land becomes used for sugar, 80% of it being owned by U.S. companies.
For real. Yo, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm so glad you mentioned Domino Sugar because, like I told you, I'm born and raised in New York, and I'm from Queens, but I used to chill a lot in Brooklyn, in Williamsburg, and there's a big Puerto Rican community there, and I would always pass by the Domino Sugar factory, and it was just interesting to me because, like, I wrote a piece about Action Anticonquista about how imperialism and gentrification are connected, but basically, like, I remember because I grew up around there, I like chilled around there a lot, and there's a lot of Puerto Ricans around the Domino Sugar Factory, and it was right on the river, and I was like, huh, like that's really interesting. Like, why is it that you have all these project buildings that were built next to the factory, and then like as I'm researching it, you start seeing like how these U.S. Capitalists literally like were kidnapping Puerto Ricans from the islands, taking them up the East River, created this factory where they're refining the sugar that was stolen from their land, and they're living in projects next to it, and it's just the levels of oppression are just fucking insane.
All intentional, all justified according to capitalism, right?
Yeah.
Into the 1920s, you have also the Merchant Marine Act, also known as the Jones Act, which was a federal statute mandating that all goods transported by water between U.S. ports be carried on ships, which meant for Puerto Rico that everything had to go through the U.S. first. And so I know to this day, the Jones Act plays a horrible role in terms of maldeveloping Puerto Rico's economy. So why don't you walk us through about that to that time period, and also into the 1950s when you have the rise of the nationalist movement?
Right now, like in this time, right, the tail end of the 19th century going into the 1900s, workers are not respected, right? You have a large illiterate population, and there's a few key figures that I'll point to, and a few key things that happen. Someone that's not really talked about that much in Boricua history is Luisa Capetillo. Luisa Capetillo is an anarchist socialist, and she becomes a newspaper reader at a cigar factory. She also was known for wearing suits because she felt comfortable wearing suits. But at that time, taboo, right?
Yeah.
But she was very well educated, and because a majority of the folks that she was working with were illiterate, she got a lot of respect from men, right? In the early 1900s, and she became a labor organizer under the Federación Libre del Trabajo, the Free Federation of Laborers, which is an attempt of Boricuas really to start advocating on behalf of agricultural workers. So in 1905, she organizes agricultural workers. She organizes labor strikes in Borinquen, in New York, in Tampa, and in Cuba.
Damn.
Right. So this individual, she's very well read. She's publishing throughout this time as a feminist. Right. She's advocating for gender equality, labor rights, and many other things. But she's particularly important because she makes a critique of society, and says that all structures of social and economic domination should be working towards the liberation of women, focusing on the areas of work, education, marriage, and religion. And so at the time, like, this person was, she's amazing. She's very important in Boricua history and doesn't get talked about enough. There's an amazing Boricua scholar and philosopher. Her name is Dr. Stephanie Rivera Berrus, based out of Milwaukee, that does some important work analyzing the influence of Capetillo in Borinquen. So I wanted to mention her because the people that are being taken advantage of have people that are beginning to advocate for them, and that's really important, right? And so all while this is happening, you have the rise of a few important individuals. Luis Muñoz Rivera, right, the father of Luis Muñoz Marin, he founded the Unionist Party, and they initially pushed for independence. But what is important to understand is they also like accepted the Jones Act, and they got, their party lost favor because of that, right? Between Luis Muñoz Rivera and Antonio Bartello, right, who were kind of the leaders of the Unionist Party, right? These are individuals that laid the groundwork for El Estado Libre Asociado. ELA is what we is like the short term, right? But that's what made us into a commonwealth, right? So at the time, you have these individuals, you have the Jones Act brought up, and it's brought up intentionally. The Jones Act serves two purposes. One, in 1917, when World War I happens, the U.S. needed people to fight, so they're like, let's get these people in our territories to fight for us. Are we going to give them rights? No. But they sure can fight for us, right? And they were placed into they were segregated. They weren't allowed to speak Spanish. If not, they were punished, right? the U.S. tested chemical warfare on people, mostly like there's a history of medical apartheid, but in the military, right? If you got caught speaking Spanish, you could either go into a gas chamber for a few minutes or you can go into a military jail for a few months. And so a lot of individuals who grew up speaking a language that they were comfortable with, if they got caught doing that thing in Panama, right, or in other Latin American countries that the U.S. was trying to take over and had war with, they would be penalized for that. And the Jones Act also creates this maritime law that is still in effect. And this maritime law is particularly devastating to Puerto Rico and aids in capitalism. Why? Because it says that Puerto Rico cannot directly import things. It can only import things from the U.S. on a U.S. flagship with the all U.S. Led, whatever you call the people that work on the ship, right? It's the most expensive one in the world. Puerto Rico invests billions of dollars because of this simple maritime act into the U.S. economy and benefits nothing from it. A ship literally passes Borinquen, goes to a port in Florida, and gets put onto a U.S. flagship. Then it gets sent back to Borinquen. So you can imagine, right? The implications of this are dire, right? There are a lot of unemployed people in the island at this time, and the U.S. is only thinking about how it can take advantage of these people, and that's why the U.S. maintaining its territorial status was really important, right? Because it debilitates and it creates a sense of false dependency on a system that does not care about the people, right? And these laws, right? People can go and they can do more research because we're just like scratching the surface. But these laws really create the conditions for the current ways in which we continue to be colonized. And they also play a particularly interesting role because they are both colonial and neo-colonial. What you have in Borinquen is a testing ground. You have a whole guinea pig island to play around and see what works for colonization, what doesn't work. Arguably, what's done in Borinquen are things that were tested, and then you see it happening throughout the Cold War time period. Right. So there's all these connections in which the colonial status of Borinquen aids the U.S. in many ways, and one of which is how do we continue to expand capitalism? How can we test out whether or not it works? Right. And you see this playing out throughout the history. But what you have, right? So I said there was Luis Muñoz Rivera and Antonio Barcello of the Unionist Party. Because people didn't like them, because they understood that the Estado Libre Asociado benefited the bourgeoisie, you have the creation in 1922 of the Partido Nacionalista de Puerto Rico, the PNP-PR, right? And this party takes a strong stance in favor of independence, which is really important considering that many of the individuals, of the working individuals, right, are being taken advantage of, right? There's no super strong unions. There are no laws on how long you can work in a day. And so people are being taken advantage of. And they're being paid significantly less. President Coolidge in 1926 appoints Frederick Holcomb as auditor of Borinquen. And this person's important because they're also the auditor of United Fruit Company. And if we understand the history of United Fruit Company and what it's done and the effects that it's had in Latin America, like, again, it started in Borinquen and you see it play out in the rest of the Caribbean and Latin America, right? The U.S. is testing things. 1927, La Operación. In the span of La Operación, which was the sterilization of women throughout Borinquen, a third of the island was sterilized. Women were not told that it was irreversible. And it was so common that in factories they would have clinics so that on your lunch break you could go get an operation to get sterilized and then go right back to work after your lunch break.
Oh my God.
And these, again, you can make reference to the current day, right? We're talking about these detention centers and the forced sterilization of immigrants and undocumented folks as if they are not human too. And so you have this. It's particularly important because people like Dr. Cornelius Rhodes is on record saying that Puerto Ricans are lazy, they're dirty, and they're degenerate. So we shouldn't let them continue to procreate, because then we'll have a world of people that think for themselves, that are fighting for the independence, that understand that they're in a colonial position. So Dr. Rhodes, has this whole move of medical apartheid throughout the island. And then we're going to get into some juicy stuff, because now in the 1930s, we have Luis Muñoz Marin, the son of Muñoz Rivera. And he starts what would eventually become the PPD, the Partido Progresista, Partido something Democrático, which is still in existence today. But it's a particular, like, this person's important, right? Because they were going, their education was partially in the U.S., partially back in the islands. Father was a politician, very familiar with the way that the U.S. works. And he championed the New Deal. He starts to become the anti-hero, right? So he is the individual that, at one time was in favor of independence, and then the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, well, it wouldn't have been the FBI at the time, but like J. Edgar Hoover was part of the Bureau of Investigations, which eventually became the FBI.
Yeah.
He creates a carpeta, right? They start to document what people are doing all across the world, right? It's the right before they create COINTELPRO, this is what they're doing. So they create a carpeta on Luis Muñoz Marin and force him into a position where he becomes the champion of, right? Not only fighting against independence, because independence was actually offered to Boricuas 2 times under the Tidings Bill. There was a senator, his last name was Tidings, and they offered independence to Puerto Rico after some events ended up happening in the islands. And the heroes and the champions that we'll be talking about of Boricua independence become the PNPR, right? The Partido Nacionalista de Puerto Rico. And you have an individual that comes into power, Don Pedro Albizu Campos, Harvard educated, right? Spoke 6 languages.
Wow.
Yeah, one of them being Greek. Like, what?
The genius.
Got degrees in the sciences, and then eventually went to law school and graduated the highest of his class. He starts to see the ways in which society treat him. He then goes on to serve 2 years in the military, where he is forced to go to an all-black battalion. He becomes one of the leaders. He goes to law school. He meets one of the leaders of the Irish Free State. He actually helps to draft the Irish Constitution.
Oh, wow.
Yes. Amazing individual. So he did, fun fact, he helped to draft the Irish Constitution after they gained independence from the British. So Ireland and Puerto Rico are having conversations that are similar and reflective to Puerto Rico in relation to Palestine right now, right? And he he goes back, right, very well educated. And what's the logical thing to do? Go back to where he grew up, Ponce, and become a people's lawyer. He practiced poverty law, and he advocates for Borinquen until he gets elected the president of the Partido Nacionalista de Puerto Rico in 1930. And this group is also important because they weren't nonviolent. In fact, they said because of our relationship to the U.S., we have to be right. We have to be violent. Like we have to be militant.
Right.
Doesn't mean we kill everybody, no. But it does mean that we have to be in armed struggle. And so he gets elected in 1930. In 1933, Francis Riggs is appointed the police chief of Puerto Rico. What Pedro Albizu Campos didn't know is that Francis Riggs worked for the military intelligence department in D.C. and just months before being appointed the police chief was in Nicaragua helping Somoza prepare for the coup that would happen in Nicaragua. Again,
that's wild. The connections.
There's a very intricate way in which the history of Borinquen is also the history of so many different oppressed people under capitalism. In 1934, Pedro Albizu Campos gave a speech to thousands of sugarcane workers that were protesting their wages. And he gets a call from Riggs, who tries to bribe him with $150,000, right? He's like, I'll give the Partido Nacionalista $150,000 if you stop organizing these sugarcane workers. I'll make you the governor of Puerto Rico if you stop organizing the sugarcane workers. Pedro Albizu Campos said, Puerto Rico is not for sale, at least not by me.
Nice.
But who was it for sale by? Muñoz Marin, who got the same offer and would eventually become the governor and the opposite, the clashing person, right, for Pedro Albizu Campos. In October of 1935, in the Massacre de Rio Piedras, 4 members of the Partido Nacionalista were murdered by the police. There's witnesses, nothing happened. 1936, Francis Riggs gets killed. He gets gunned down by 2 Boricuas that are part of the Partido Nacionalista, Elias Bucamp and Hiram Rosado. Instead of allowing these individuals to go through what the U.S. would call due process, when they went to the police station, they were killed, cold-blooded. They went to the police station, the police killed them. So you have people in Borinquen that are like, you just murdered 2 people. Americans are like, oh my God, Francis Riggs got killed, right?
Wow.
And Boricuas, whether they were for the Partido Nacionalista or not, were infuriated that their people didn't get trial. They were just massacred. And so you see a move on the island, and then 1937, Ponce Massacre happened. And this is particularly important because the Partido Nacionalista de Puerto Rico, right, planned a march through Ponce. They got a permit, and then it was taken away the day before, but they did it anyways. So the militant branch of the Partido Nacionalista at the time, they were like they're called cadets, right? They were in form, right, ready to march. And as they get a command to move forward, you have cops lined up with Tommy guns, shotguns, regular pistols, and tear gas. So as the cadets, who are, by the way, although they were militant, for this particular occasion, they were unarmed, right? And so this is a parade. So people are celebrating. It is Palm Sunday, right, in Ponce, 1937. The police kill 18 unarmed youth. The cadets were between the ages of 15 and 24. right? 18 of them were killed, including a child, a 7-year-old child. 2 police officers killed one of their own people in the crossfire. And there's a story about Cadet Bolivar Marquez, where after being shot, he crawls to a wall, dips his hand in the blood, and writes, "Viva la República, abajo los asesinos," right? Long live the Republic, down the murderers, right? So much belief in the necessity for the independence that before he died, he used his own blood to send a message, a very clear one.
It's beautiful.
Everything, yes, and Pedro Albizu Campos, the leader of the Partido Nacionalista de Puerto Rico, was arrested with 8 others. Right? There's picture evidence. There was a 13-minute video that was recorded of the whole thing. Given all this evidence, they were still found guilty and charged 10 years in prison. So they take him to La Princesa and then eventually send him to Atlanta. And in Atlanta, he finds a book that I think everyone should kind of delve into. I'm not going to say too much about it. It's written by General Smedley Butler. It's called War is a Racket. He had a career in the Marine Corps for 33 years and talks about the ways that he helped set the groundwork for the U.S. and U.S. banks to go into places in Latin America and the Caribbean, and said that he would never go to war for the U.S. again because of capitalist scumbags. Now, it doesn't give him any type of cool points or whatever, right? Like, he was fucked up for that. And at least he left documentation. Pedro Albizu Campos found this book while he was incarcerated. Eventually, 1947, Pedro Albizu Campos gives a speech to 14,000 Boricuas after being released. And then in 1948, and we talked about this when we first got on, La Ley de la Mordaza is what it's called, right? A gag law. In Puerto Rico, there was a time in which me wearing this pin, right? Me having this flag or this flag, saying anything about independence or having a flag, you would be given a minimum of 7 years in prison. Over 3,000 people throughout the time of La Mordaza were sent to prison, some serving up to 20 years. For singing, for having una bandera, for reading something about independence, right? Like wildly fascist. So there's La Ley de la Mordaza. Eventually, you have the creation of the PSP, the Partido Socialista de Puerto Rico, which is created in 1959. From that, you get the creation of the Ejército Popular Boricua. Eventually, they would be known as the Macheteros in 1976, and one of the leaders was Filiberto Ojedas. It's important to note that the Ejército Popular Boricua, the Macheteros, are scientific socialists, right? So they are scientific socialists, and they're doing their theory and they're doing their action, right? So this is a military, like, straight up. They are known in history for stealing $7.1 million from Wells Fargo on September 12, 1983, and still the money has not been found. And they did it on September 12th. Why? Because that's Pedro Albizu Campos' birthday, right? So they're very intentional with the ways that they would do things. And so eventually, Filiberto Ojedas, who is a socialist, who is literally fighting for the independence of Borinquen, gets incarcerated. He's released. And unfortunately, in 2005, the FBI raids, surrounds his house, and they, like, over 40 officers, they had helicopters, right? They killed him. They said they wanted to talk with him, and he's like, y'all motherfuckers are gonna have to take me dead because I am not going out there with all y'all with guns. So they got into a shootout. And unfortunately, he was massacred, and this still has gone unanswered. Like no one has been held accountable for the death of Filiberto. Another individual of particular importance is Lolita Lebrón, who was part of the Partido Nacionalista de Puerto Rico and the Partido Socialista de Puerto Rico, right? But she was based out of New York at the time. In in the 19 sorry, I'm gonna have to
I think in the 1950s, right? Or
1954. I'm sorry. So in 1954, Lolita Lebrón, along with Rafael Cancel Miranda and two other individuals, go into the House of Congress. Lolita unfurls a Boricua flag, right? And she says, and she yells, "Viva Puerto Rico Libre!" And they start shooting, right? So she's shooting up towards the wall, and then Rafael Cancel Miranda and his other comrades are shooting at the congressman. They end up wounding 5 people and go on to serve their sentences. Fun fact about Rafael Cancel Miranda, the year before that, he was in Cuba before the dictator took over, right? He was helping with the government over there. And then we have Filiberto, Lolita, the Young Lords in the 1960s were coming into power, and they're particularly important because, like I was saying towards the beginning, right? Boricuas, no matter where they are, right? Very principled Boricuas are always fighting for independence, and they can be on the moon. They're gonna fight for the independence of Boricuas. And the Young Lords were an organization that came out in a time where the diaspora understands that they are in a different type of colonial dilemma, right? Under capitalism, where they're living in the belly of the beast, and so they're living that experience, but they also know back home that their people are experiencing. And so the Young Lords, principal MLs, just like the Black Panthers, and they end up creating a 13-point program. They're also known for championing women's rights and incorporating that. Unlike the Black Panthers 10-point program, the 13-point program like talked about the role of women and the importance of women, like in the foundational, like moving forward of the organization. Eventually, COINTELPRO would infiltrate and do what they did to organizations, especially socialist organizations of that time, and destroy them. But it's important to note the Young Lords were part of the Rainbow Coalition. Chairman Fred Hampton did an amazing job, right? There was the American Indian Movement, Black Panthers, Young Lords, Young Patriots, right? Across the board, people that were fighting for the independence and understand that international proletarian struggle is the only way to move forward and not to be distracted by the other things, right? Those things can be talked about like outside of fighting for this struggle. But right now, we are all fighting for the independence of oppressed people under this system called capitalism. And that is particularly important because he says you cannot fight racism with racism, you fight racism with solidarity. And he critiques Black capitalism and Black capitalists too, because no form of capitalism is gonna help liberate oppressed people anywhere.
Exactly. No, well said, comrade. I mean, there's so much. That's the beautiful thing about Boricua history. There's so much and so many layers to it. But I think you did such an amazing job at setting that up for those of us who are not fully familiar with it but are learning about it. Thank you so much, Comrade Libre. We just spoke with Comrade Libre, Afro-Boricua poet and communist based out of Miami, Florida, whose organizing involves theory and action. Their work primarily involves working with the youth and helping build alternatives outside of capitalism. Connor, we need to have you back on. Most definitely, like you were dropping some real knowledge on all of us right now. How can we follow and support your work?
So you can follow. I'm part of a collective based here in Miami called Troika Kollective.
Shout out to Troika Kollective. I love the work.
Yes, yeah, we're putting out some work, and when we meet up again, we'll talk about Borinquen being the crux of capitalism and like being the thing that really kills capitalism. But definitely you can follow us at Troika Kollective and read the article.
Cool. That's what's up, comrade. Peace out. Have a great day. Take care.
Peace.